Before we get started, I got some news this afternoon, and I don't know how many people are involved with have been involved with RMSP.
Yeah, I was going
Rocket,
to ask about that too. I got that email this afternoon.
is that Carl? Carl, yeah, thanks for
Yeah,
your email today with the link, too.
sure.
But yeah, they announced, which is, I've been working for them for 30 years. They announced they're closing the school. So that's a really kind of a sad thing. I'm still kind of in shock because I got the news this afternoon. So I do a little bit of teaching for them in their career training program. But anyway, just have lots of friends that'll be affected by that decision today. And
And
yeah,
in the email, they mentioned Forrest and Sarah. Are those the owners?
yeah, they are the directors of the school. Their parents, well, the Chappitt family own the school, and that's Sarah and Forrest, who are young. And then Neil and Jean started the school back in the day, 35 years ago in Georgia. It was called the Southeast Center for Photography or something like that. And then they moved to Missoula. But they're still involved, but Forrest and Sarah basically run the programs there.
Right, right. Because
All
it did
just
say that
beautiful
they were,
people.
yeah, because it did say that they were going to form a small media company. They're going to do YouTube videos and online classes, and basically they're going to continue educating photographers.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I think that's certainly their career training was a really strong thing for them. But if they can do that, certainly I will support them in any way that I can.
of
Um,
course.
yeah, absolutely. So anyway, so yeah, and certainly I can get started whenever you'd like if you have some housekeeping to do, Kyle.
Yes, yes, we do. We usually start off with just a little bit of club news and then talking to our guest and then introduce you and all that good stuff. So,
Okay, great. I'm
all right,
looking
you can
forward to
sit
the
back and
evening for
relax for a
sure.
few minutes here. So, before I turn it over to you, Kyle, I just want to mention, the standard kind of stuff that, we got a competition in 2 weeks. Our competition topic this month is open, which means that you can submit any topic, any subject, any kind of camera, any kind of time of day, anything you want.
That's
Well,
nice.
or if you'd like, you can follow what Mark suggested at our last meeting and take the open term literally and show a photo of something that is open.
That's awesome.
I love that. That was a cool thing, Mark.
Absolutely.
We do have a guest here on Zoom. I see the small group at Lone Tree, and I know that those are all members. Madeline, you have joined us via Zoom. We normally talk to our guest and get a little information about them. If you would unmute and give us a little bit about how you found us, the type of photography you do, things like that.
Sure. Yep, my name's Madeline. I do a lot of photography with my dad normally, so I'm trying to kind of get involved a little bit more in Denver, kind of in between our trips, I guess. But I like to do a lot of photography of like nature, and we have a trip coming up where we're going to go to the Rockies and do some pictures, like nighttime pictures of the northern lights and everything. So
Awesome.
pretty excited about that. But yeah, mainly like nature type photos I like to do.
Awesome. Well, we have a lot of people in our club membership who are also nature photographers. You go back and look at any of the online galleries that we have on our website from past competitions or some of our videos, you'll see that. And of course, for nighttime photography, you joined us on the perfect evening because
Right.
that's what Doug will be talking to us about. So, welcome.
Cool.
We're glad to have you
Thank
here.
you.
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, welcome, Madeline.
That's really all I have. So, Kyle, I will turn it to you, friend.
All right, thanks, Carl. I don't have anything terribly formal, Doug, by way of introduction here, but I do want to just kind of mention a couple things to the group to familiarize you guys with Doug. He's got over 20 years of experience as a photographer and an educator, and He has done 150 workshops around the world, Havana, Cuba, and Africa, and all over the place. So he also has a bunch of stuff on his website, a bunch of online workshops and other things that he does. So this guy's the real deal. He's not kidding around. He really puts his money where his mouth is, and lives the photography life. We were talking earlier, those of you who were on early heard us talking about this, but one thing that he does online is a home room, he called it, where you can join twice a month and just geek out about photography. It's information on that is it's a 2-hour meeting, and information on that is on his website. I'm sure he'll share that with us. But I'll just say, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Doug. I'll say, and I'm reading
Okay.
this from your website, that he believes education and truth are the means to the end, and that good old-fashioned love, peace, and fun are the vehicles we use to navigate through our journey. I like that.
Hey, thank you, Kyle. I like that. But I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you guys. I love photo. I love the sharing of photography with students, because I learn a lot from my students over the years, and I'm from Denver, so so this is kind of fun. I grew up there, moved to Crested Butte as a young guy, and spent 15 years in Crested Butte as an avalanche forecaster for the ski area, because my degree was in meteorology. But I turned my attention to photo back in 1997. So I've been teaching workshops, and I still love to do that. It's my passion, and I go a lot of different places. And I'll show you a few slides of just 3 workshops that I still have openings for that are coming up. If you're ever incited by going on a trip and learning photography and with a bunch of fun people. But other than that, in terms of this evening, yeah, I'm going to be talking about night photography. And it's not too technical, but there is some camera settings that you could be aware of. Also, during this time that we have together tonight, I encourage questions and your thoughts. And so we have time to just stop and entertain a question or two, and certainly any thoughts that you have about what we're discussing, whether that's through your experiences or whatever. But if it feels like that we're going to go down a rabbit hole, I might push that off a little bit. But we will take a break after an hour just to get up and move around, because that's what my doctor recommends. So we'll take a little stretch break. And then just a question: how many people have never shot at night? Is there anybody here that has never photographed at night? All right, so there's nobody. So some of this stuff might be a review, and you might pick up some tips about certain things, subject matter, in terms of what you're photographing, and some of the settings, and I will certainly provide that. But without further ado, should we get started? What's so fun about shooting at night? Anybody have a thought on that?
Stumbling around in the dark.
Yeah, I love that. I love being able to, certainly figure out your camera, which normally you don't have too much light to be able to see all the buttons. And that becomes, if you're new to it or relatively new, it becomes a little bit of a challenge. And that's certainly why a little red flashlight is appropriate for shooting at night. But I think the funnest thing about it is the camaraderie with your fellow students. It's you capture stuff that you don't normally see, because normally when we're like painting with light, that's something that's almost like a video when you just look at it. But the still image of your paint job is certainly what's going to dictate how you approach it. And so that's kind of a mystery. It's and I love mysteries in photography, and certainly shooting at night is one of those things. Like, you can capture things in the Milky Way that you don't normally see, because the sensor is more sensitive to light than your vision. So all those things are really fun to basically go out and share with friends and fellow photographers, and and just be out at night, which you don't normally do, staring at the sky like that. So that's one fun thing for me, for sure. If you know anything about this particular shot, this is Delicate Arch, or I mean, not Delicate Arch. This is Landscape Arch in Arches National Park. And there's a story around this that Delicate Arch and Landscape Arch were named wrong when they made the maps, because when you go and visit Delicate Arch is in the landscape, whereas this being Landscape Arch is very delicate. So they say that names have, they screwed up the names when they made the maps, which is kind of funny, isn't it? All right. So tonight, in terms of some considerations that we're going to approach, one of them is lightning. Certainly, we'll talk a little bit about that and discuss twilight, because that's when most people start to put their cameras away that have not shot at night. And twilight becomes a really important consideration, certainly when we're thinking about shooting in low light. It's a beautiful time of day. We will consider the moon, certainly, because that's all obviously more visible and appropriate in composition at night. We'll talk about carnivals, starlight. We're going to touch on each of these in terms of their settings and some considerations in that regard. Painting with light, cars, car light, trails of cars and their lights, street light. And so these are the sort of mini topics that we're going to approach in this sort of broad landscape of shooting at night. And one more thing, we're going to consider fireworks, even though we just passed the holiday. We will talk a little bit about that. So I think one thing that we need to think about, and we're going to approach this in the way that we're talking about sunset and beyond going into the night. And we have three very important things that happen right after sunset. And this is also repeated in the morning. And what are those things? It's civil twilight, nautical, and astronomical. And these have very important things about them that we should be aware of. And those are all the twilights before we get to night. And so let's start this discussion off, talking about sunset. And sunset, obviously, before we head into civil twilight, is the time when the sun is beautiful. Landscape photographers love it. Wedding photographers love sunrise and sunset. Portrait photographers, architect photographers, all those people love the beautiful light at sunrise and sunset. And that's why they call it what? What hour do they call this? When the light is so beautiful right before
golden.
Terry?
Golden.
Yeah, the golden light, the magic light, and it lasts so briefly in most cases, unless you're at high latitudes. Yeah, that we can describe it as the golden light, certainly, and that's appropriate too. And the challenge here is that basically that the exposure becomes a little bit more difficult during these times when the sun is really low on the horizon in the morning and evenings. But certainly we won't get in too much of a discussion about that, because we're going to talk about night, low light and night. But it's certainly a fun time to take pictures. And one of the really fun things that I like to think about when we're shooting when the sun is setting is basically silhouettes. Constantly looking for silhouettes to put into a composition, because they can be so dramatic, like this strong silhouette, or certainly this one of Akatia and Big Bend. Just beautiful, because the shape becomes really, really important of your subject that's silhouetted. And normally, in terms of exposure, you just need to expose for the highlight, which is basically the color in the sky, and then that will produce the silhouette, which is normally, black without detail in a lot of situations. But once the sun has set, then we go into the first stage, the first twilight, and that's civil twilight, where the sun is below the horizon just from 0 to like 6 degrees. It ends about a half an hour, depending on the latitude, after sunset and certainly before sunrise. But the important thing about civil twilight is your landscape details fade to black. So you can see your feet and what you're walking around before when civil twilight starts. And then at the end, you can't basically see where you're walking. And so that's important. That's why they named it civil twilight, because back in the day, hunters and gatherers would, without artificial light, obviously, would not leave their homes to basically go do their daily tasks, because at the end of civil twilight in the evening, they couldn't see to walk around. So that's hence the name civil twilight. It's an important thing for us because basically there's a balance between the ambient light of civil twilight and artificial light. And certainly that becomes important in a lot of different ways, because some of the things that we like to shoot are light, neon lights, city lights, car lights, all those things that you capture, where you want light in the sky with the color, but you still want to capture those lights that appear as we're trending into darkness. And it's especially true for the moon, because if you wait too long during civil twilight, you can expose for the moon, but your sky and landscape are black. And if you expose for the landscape or the sky and the landscape, then your moon is basically blown out. And so there's a balance during this time period, and that's why it's important to discuss in a lecture considering low light. Yes, and certainly this is during civil twilight is when the landscape is dark and you get beautiful color in the sky. And that can happen 15 minutes after the sun is set, where your sky actually lights up, illuminates, and provides all the warmth from the sun that's setting. Just a super, super fun time. And it's a pretty easy exposure. Certainly you can use your histogram, but I use my spot meter a lot because that's the way I was trained. And so basically in a sunset situation, sunrise situation as well, you can meter two different places. You can meter the place with the richest color in the sky and just zero out your meter. And I'm talking with my spot meter. A lot of people don't use their spot meters much anymore, but anyway, this is what I'm doing with my spot meters, just metering the richest color in the sky and zeroing out the meter.
So Doug, can I just quick question?
Absolutely, Kyle.
Is this a handheld metering device, or is it are you changing a setting in camera?
Yeah, changing the set, the exposure mode to spot metering as opposed to evaluative or center weighted, so that all the metering system within that little circle that I'm showing you will determine the exposure.
Yeah, that's what I thought you meant. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering about that. But yeah, and the spot meter is great with a Nikon camera, and I'm not sure I think Sony, you can move it around. Canon, the spot meter is where your autofocus point is in the center. Even though the autofocus point may move, the spot meter is in the center of the camera, which is no problem because you're going to take your camera off and meter the scene if you're using your spot meter before you shoot. So anyway, you can meter the richest color like this. 100% of the reading is an average tone right there, and zero out the meter, and then you'll get the proper exposure. Or you can meter the brightest part of the scene and just open up a stop. So like here, a pastel kind of a yellow, and that's just a +1. But once again, you can use your, with live view and mirrorless and DSLR, you can now look at the histogram and evaluate the exposure anyway. So it's not that big a deal really to do that. It's just, that's kind of the way I do it. So then you can also use, like we said, your histogram. Is that how everybody else that doesn't use like a metering system in terms of like a spot evaluates their exposure, you're using your histograms?
I would say for the most part, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. The histogram becomes a really important tool, and just evaluating an exposure. And here, the histogram is showing that basically the blacks are clipped, or basically they have no detail in the blacks. But then obviously in the moving towards the right in the histogram, you have nice bright sky up there, which is the yellow within the orange, which is on the right side of the histogram. So yeah, be mindful. And if you need to learn about the histogram, it certainly is a super valuable tool. All right. And so, yeah, beautiful time, obviously, to capture the beautiful last, hues in the sky in terms of the color and saturated color during civil twilight. And like I said, it's also a time where you balance artificial light with ambient light. Like this picture of Peggy's Cove, where you have the green Fresnel lens in the lighthouse. It balances the color that you see in the landscape. And so that becomes a really important time period to capture those two things in balance. And that's normally occurs generally in this half an hour, about 15 to 20 minutes after the sun has set, where you can balance the two artificial and natural light sources. So it becomes an important time to think about when you're capturing a lighthouse or a lonely gas station in Death Valley. The balance between the beautiful hues and color, certainly of the artificial light balance with that blueness of civil twilight. And like I said, it's also a time to think about silhouettes during this time, not only when the sun is setting or rising, but also during civil twilight, because there's, remember, no light on the landscape per se. And so it's going to become really dark the way the sensor records the light. And so if you meter for the color in the sky, then you're going to get normally a silhouette, but you'll capture the color and a beautiful silhouette, which, when you think about it, silhouettes can be a little challenging in terms of they have to be simple for you to understand what the composition is about. And they can't be too complex. Like this is a really simple silhouette during civil twilight. And so is this. The bird silhouetted, the guy, the boy, the industrial stacks, whatever those are, and the rocks. And once again, capturing the color in the sky. Certainly, here's another simple silhouette of just a shrub in Death Valley, but exposing for the sky and the cloud. And also, it's a great time to capture the ambient light from like a fairgrounds during the summer, like this, with the beautiful color in the sky, balancing the artificial light of a ride here. And so to really be thinking about that as the sun sets and you're in a situation where you can capture artificial and natural light, think about that 15 to 20 minutes after the sun is set. Because once it gets beyond that, it starts to get too dark to capture both. You have to make a decision unless you're using HDR or something like that. But just in one shot, it becomes a little more challenging. So when we think about all these things, city scenes, neon, car trails, and carnivals, just a good starting point is, around a low ISO, around f8, and somewhere between 10 and 30 seconds. Now, this is going to change depending how bright the scene is. If you have lots of artificial light, you might have to adjust this. But this is just a starting point for capturing both artificial light, certainly like car trails, carnivals, city scenes, neon, things like that. Just a sort of a baseline to start with. So here in the Tetons, I just set up my tripod on the side of the road and drove my car through the scene because nobody else was around. And it was a 30-second exposure here to capture the full scene of the car going through on the highway there through the scene. Here's just a 10-second exposure in a city in Missoula. And I really like to go out after a rain in a city to capture the light that's reflected off the surface, because normally when it's dry, you don't get that reflected surface. And so it doesn't really reflect any kind of beautiful light that you get from some of the neon or things like that. So, and this is just a 10-second exposure. And certainly, once again, you can use your histogram just to evaluate that proper exposure. I had a bike race, and then some guy riding through with a headlamp, kind of advertising the power gel there. And that was a 30-second exposure as well. And so here, it's starting to get at the end of civil twilight. So this is one of those situations where you're not too late, but that blue in the background, if it was another 10 minutes, you would lose basically that blue color in the sky, which I think really enhances this. So once again, paying attention to that time period after the sun is set and not waiting too long to show up at the carnival or the fairgrounds to shoot. It's just such a beautiful time to capture both of those. And here I bumped up my ISO to basically get a faster shutter speed because I didn't want too much motion in the ride itself. So here, working with the f-stop shutter speed and aperture in the reciprocal relationship to basically capture what you need in terms of motion in this situation. And here the same way with these people, just had to speed up the shutter speed a little bit and push the ISO quite a bit to 12,800 in this situation to capture this scene. And what's so beautiful these days about being able to bump up your ISO is that now you have the ability to enhance, meaning denoise the photo. Because of the high ISO, you can basically remove the noise to a certain degree in both Lightroom and a lot of other different programs, Lightroom, Photoshop, Topaz, DxOs, Pure Raw. They now use AI technology to basically get rid of the noise. So you can really play around with your ISO these days because you have the ability to fix it to a certain degree, which is really kind of a new technology in the last, I don't know, couple years. So they're getting better and better and better with regard to ISO noise, which is awesome to be able to do that. Here, once again, bumping up the ISO to get a fast enough shutter speed of 30th of a second to capture just a little motion in the highway traffic. Does anybody have any questions about that? Comments? Okay, good. Another thing to think about, Streetlight, certainly exposure. You can meter for the ambient light and then obviously consider the highlight or use your histogram once again. And a good starting point is, like I just mentioned, 100 low ISO, f8 at 10 to 30 seconds. And then if you need a faster shutter speed, like I was just discussed, you can bump up the ISO or open up the aperture if depth of field isn't important. So it's just a matter of working these three exposure variables to get exactly what you need. And then use your histogram in live view or during the review of those images. So once again, just starting point, set your settings, adjust them as needed, and then use your histogram in live view or take a shot and review it afterwards to see if you got the detail where you need it. Just a mild little starting point right there. And always know the risks and use good judgment when you're shooting at night. All right, and some of the color that you'll experience during Streetlight is varied. I mean, there's so many different colors from different light sources, from incandescent, which is deep yellow, to lens covered lights that, put a cover on their light to create a different color. But there are a lot of different sources of light and a lot of different colors to that light, which is part of the magic, really, of shooting at night, to be able to see how the camera records that color, because we often balance the color in our minds. Basically, if something is subtly yellow, we'll see it as more neutral, unless you have a really trained eye to see those specific colors. But normally it plays a little bit of a trick on us, our mind, when we view color. Seriously, fun to capture it, that's for sure. Like in this scene of Arco, Idaho, that was their billboard at the community center there, and they're having a quilt show in the first city that was lit by atomic power. Kind of a funny scene there. But look at this this color of light, probably a fluorescent light, being green. But kind of fun to find these little interesting sort of things in your hometown as you run around at night.
Hey, Doug, this is Carl. I just sorry to interrupt. I just got a quick question on this.
No worries at all.
Okay, since you're talking about the different colors of lights that you may encounter when doing night and street stuff, what do you suggest for doing for white balance?
Well, the thing about white balance is that basically, I have personally I have my white balance on a daylight, because daylight is the only white balance setting that will accurately record the light that is in front of you. It's the only setting. All the other settings, like auto and incandescent and fluorescent and open shade and cloudy, all of them will change the color temperature of the light that you see to what they think is more predominant in that scene. And so realistically, I have not changed my white balance setting in my camera for 15 years. I don't even worry about it in the field, because I'm shooting raw files, and I can change the color temperature and change it if I don't like it, or I can enhance it later on in processing. It's just one more thing to think about in the field. And for me personally, it's just on daylight and I don't even think about it. But that's a great question, Carl. And I'd be interested to hear what other people think.
Yeah, thanks for explaining. That kind of makes sense too. Like you said, when you're out shooting, if you just leave your white balance alone, then you don't have to worry about it. You don't have to think about it. You just focus on composition and everything else and exposure.
Yep, go ahead.
And also, like you said, I think most of us do shoot raw. So, being able to reset the color balance later, the color temperature, if you want a different effect, if you want a different look, if you, want to see how it's changed or whatever,
yes,
that gives all the flexibility we need.
Yeah, and a lot of situations you're like on a street corner or whatever, and there's a lot of different color temperatures of light. And so by using daylight, you're going to accurately record all those different color temperatures of light, as opposed to an auto setting, which will change the bias that's presented in the scene itself. Like if we go and look at this scene right here, basically what auto is going to do is basically add a bunch of blue to the scene to balance the red and the orange that it sees. Or in this situation, it's going to add a bunch of magenta to balance the green that you see. And the highlight of this picture is the green. Do you know what I mean?
So well, sure. And not only that, but like you said, here you got the mixture of light. It looks like you got sodium vapor lights on those 4 spots.
Right,
plus,
exactly.
Plus the fluorescence there. So you throw a bunch of magenta into those yellow-orange lights, and they just go totally different from what you saw.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Carl. Definitely. And for you take a scene like this, just a parking lot with yellow and blue, and the camera is gonna be biased by the blue. And so what it's going to do if you have it on auto, it's going to add more yellow to make the blue more balanced towards white. And so that really doesn't work. Obviously, you can change it later, but we go back to the point that basically you don't have to think about it in the field if it's on daylight. You're just going to record that color and then you can change it later. So that's why I have my daylight or my camera on daylight balanced, and I haven't changed it forever. It's just, that's the way I do it. So yeah, good comment, Carl, definitely. And here, obviously, fluorescent again, but beautiful. I love the green in this shot. Or I love the red, you know, in this shot. And you can see in the background what color or what light source this is. Because it's on daylight, we're recording the color temperature light that's accurate. And you can see that it's a fluorescent light bulb, basically in the that's illuminating the background plates and stuff because they're green. And that's a nice play in terms of complementary colors between the red and the green. That captured it perfectly to be able to create that dynamic between the two colors, complementary colors. Great thought, Carl, in terms of white balance. Great question. And here, just you know, a building in downtown Missoula, and I illuminated the bench with a flash, just to highlight that bench coming in. Here's a nice balance of blues and yellows. And what do you think is producing the star effect around some of the specular highlights? It's not stopping down to F22, which would normally create that star effect.
You've got one of those old school Coke and filters or something.
That's exactly right, Carl. It's one of those old four, I think they called it something for something because it gave the effect of the four beams coming off a specular highlight. This is an old photograph, but that's how I did it. I don't even know if I have that filter anymore, but fun to play around with. That's for sure.
Doug?
Yeah.
Going
Go
back
ahead.
to the previous photo where you lit the bench, so it looks like a different color than the background, or is it?
No, Flash is pretty neutral. And in fact, Flash has a bias towards a little bit of a blue hue to it. And so that's why they have a Flash white balance setting on your camera, because Flash is a little bit blue. And so if you were to turn on your Flash white balance setting, that's going to add a little bit of warmth to this whole scene, which would remove a little bit of the blue, which it's a little hard to see in this situation, but it would remove a little bit of blue and it would add more yellow to the background if you were globally changing things. But yeah, this Flash is certainly a different color because the Flash is not affecting the background whatsoever. It's only affecting the bench. Did that answer your question, Terry?
It does answer it, but as a follow-on, do you concern yourself about the color of your flashlight that you're putting on the scene?
No, I'm not, because basically I'm going to change that in processing. So I could easily select the bench and the concrete slab as a local adjustment, like a gradient tool, and then basically add blue to it or whatever else I wanted. And I would think about doing that here. I think the yellow is so strong. I think I'd probably go back to this one and add a little bit of blue to the bench, a little more blue. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Terry. Thank you. So here's another little scene balancing the flash that I produced. I flashed the wall because it was completely black. So added a little bit of light to the wall to sort of fill in that darkness with the storefronts in Denver here. This is a technique just because you have a longer exposure, you're just basically creating in-camera movement. And here I'm just zooming with the lens to create the blur effect coming out from the center stained glass window. And it almost looks like an angel in a way. I kind of like that effect in this particular photo. So that's kind of fun to do. Create a little ICM. Since you're working with longer exposures and when you're shooting in low light, you do have the opportunity to create some ICM in camera movement and motion with your photos. Fun thing to play around with, that's for sure. And that's something we didn't ever do in the film days because film was expensive, right? But now we can ultimately just try so many different things and in different shutter speeds and all those things to create different kinds of looks to our photo without, having to spend more money. So that's pretty awesome. And the moon, like I said, the moon is one of those things that you really need to think about the timing. And we talked about civil twilight. We're still in that kind of frame of mind here. And so like this, when you're thinking about the moon, you have to think about the timing. Remember, like 15 minutes. Certainly you can take a picture of the moon during the day, and it's visible and it's present for us. But once we start getting towards night, which we normally think about moon shots, we want to think about the timing of it. And that's that 15 to 20 minute time period after the sun is set or before it has risen, where you can balance, like in this situation, the color of the sky with the detail and the brightness of the moon. And even this shot has detail in the moon. You can barely see it because it's so thin, but certainly it's there. And so when we think about the timing of, everybody likes to shoot the full moon, right? That's a really fun time period to shoot at night, is when the full moon is up. And so let's look at it. Let's look at the next full moon in Denver, Colorado, which is going to be on July 21st, coming up in a week or so. What's today, the 10th? Not quite 2 weeks. But let's look at when to shoot it in terms of the relationship between when the moon rises and basically when the sun sets, because that's going to be really important in this discussion that we're talking about, where we need to shoot the moon when it's in civil twilight around that 15 to 20 minute time period. So July 21st, the sun sets at 8:21. And all these other dates, it's only a minute or two difference between the two. So we're not going to present that time. But if we look at the time that the moon rises compared to the time that the sun has set, we look at this first one when the moon is full on July 21st, and basically it's full at 100%. The moon rises at 9:10 and the sun sets at 8:20. What's the difference in terms of those times? 50 minutes, right? 8:20 to 9:10. So is that within the time period where you can get detail in the moon and you get color or detail in the landscape? No. The sun has risen basically too late to get detail in the moon and get color in the sky. So that's not a good day to shoot it. But let's look at the day previous. So July 20th, the moon rises at 8:30, which is 9 minutes, basically, if you consider the 8:21 time that the sun has set. That is within that time period that we've been discussing previously, right? So I give that a green light in terms of it's the time that would be good to shoot it. It's still almost full. It's waxing at 99.8. And so it appears to be full on when you look at a photograph of it, but it's definitely within that time period. What do you have to be concerned about with the moon rising at 8:30 and the sun setting at 8:20? Your location. Certainly in Missoula, Montana, there's mountains that surround this town. And so is the moon going to be up basically in enough time to capture the detail in both? And it just depends on where you are in the valley. So you really need to do some legwork, some research to determine if that's a good time. But let's look at the day before. Sun rises, or the moon rises at 7:37. The sun sets at 8:21. And so the moon is up in the sky, certainly, and you might be able to capture the moon at a good time period before or as the sun sets. So I would give that one a green. But if you look at the day after, the moon rises at 9:45, and that's an hour. That's over an hour and 20 minutes after the sun is set. So that's not a good time, and neither obviously is January 23rd. Because you don't get a full moon and it's coming up way too late. So does that kind of idea, are you guys understanding that in terms of you have to do a little legwork in order to find out when the moon is rising compared to when the sun sets? And what you expect to get out of that situation? Is that making sense there?
Yeah, makes really good sense.
Okay, good.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you can find out this information a lot of different places. You know, PhotoPills is one. You can go to the Ephemeris. Ephemeris is another place. You can find that on almost any weather app too. But the beauty of the Ephemeris is you can find out how these things affect, or how the landscape affects when the moon rises over a certain mountain or whatever. And PhotoPills does that very same thing. So a couple different applications that can really help you plan your next moonshot. So just a couple things to think about in terms of metering the moon. If you've ever heard of the Sunny 16 rule, how many people have heard of the Sunny 16 exposure method? Aha, Nancy has. Is anybody else?
I think anybody who started photography, back in the film days is
Yes.
probably well familiar with it.
Right, Sunny 16. So it said because the light from the sun on a cloudless day is so consistent, you take the ISO and you take 1 over the ISO to get your shutter speed, and by f8. And so in a Sunny 16, that's ISO 100 at 1 over 100 for your shutter speed at f16, and that's the proper exposure for the sun. But in the moon, basically, it's a little bit darker. It's still pretty bright. It's only 2 stops difference. So you can call it Moony 8 in terms of the ability just to set the f-stop shutter speed in ISO. You can call it Moony 8 and set your aperture at f8 at 1 over 100 at ISO 100. And that will capture detail in the moon. That's not saying that it's going to capture the proper exposure for the sky and the landscape, but it is for the moon itself. So that's one method. The other method is to meter the moon. And so if you're familiar with the spot meter, you can just put the spot meter right on the moon, open up about 1.5 to 2 stops, and that will guarantee that you get detail in the moon. And or you can use your histogram. That's another way to evaluate the exposure on the moon itself. So a bunch of different ways to go about metering for the moon. And probably the easiest thing is to use the histogram or use the Sunny or Moony 8 rule, so to speak. And then another thing about the moon in terms of the shutter speed, when you go to set your exposure, is the moon moves, right, everybody? Or the earth turns. All those things are happening. So nobody wants to get a moon tube. I mean, moon tubes, I say no to moon tubes. And you can see that in the shot that the moon has actually moved during this long exposure. So the setting, you can use this calculation in terms of your shutter speed. You take 250 over the focal length, and then you'll get a clear shot of the moon in your frame. And so if we take a focal length of say 50, you divide 250 by 50, and you get 5 seconds is the longest exposure you should use to get a pretty sharp moon without a moon tube. Is everybody with me on this one?
Yep.
It's a
That's great
simple,
info.
simple little calculation. You put on a lens, you take the 250 divided by that focal length that you're using, and that basically is your shutter speed if you don't want to get a moon tube.
Is that the focal length of the lens as the lens is marked, or is that the 35 millimeter equivalent?
That's a great question, Mark, and that would be you'd need to do the conversion. So if you have a focal, or I mean a 1.5 crop sensor, like on a Nikon DSLR, then you would basically first you would divide 50 by 1.5, which basically gives you 75, right?
I understand.
75 millimeters, and then take 250 by 75.
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to do the math here really quick because I got a phone that can do it. And your exposure's around 3 seconds. Because a longer focal length, the moon moves further in a crop sensor situation compared to the full frame. So that's a great thought, Mark, is yeah, do the conversion first. Okay, switching a little bit of a gears, lightning exposure. Certainly, the first thing that you have to do is meter for the ambient light, and then you're gonna consider the lightning. And just general statement, use the histogram after the review to make sure that you got the proper ambient light exposure. And that's if there's lots of light. Normally ambient light, if you have lots of light and you're shooting lightning, then you have to first just consider the ambient light exposure first. So you would meter for that, and then obviously it would depend on the lightning. And certainly a lot of this is it's a crapshoot generally in terms of capturing lightning unless you have a device, which I'll show you the device that I've used in the past. But anyway, just a couple different approaches to this in terms of capture for longer exposures, which are when it's darker, you can use the Wild West approach, meaning it's pure luck that you open the shutter as the lightning strikes. So that's a little bit of a challenge, certainly, and I never have been successful in that. Really, in terms of capturing the best part of the lightning. Or you can use a bulb, your shutter speed on bulb, and you use a black card. So you just cover up the lens, put it on bulb, and then when you think the lightning is going to strike, you basically remove the black card and then put it back after you've hopefully captured the lightning. Does everybody understand that technique? So you just are covering up the lens with something that blocks all the light. And I've used my checkbook before. I've used a hat. I've used all kinds of stuff to block that light. And certainly I haven't been that successful really on capturing lightning. But here's my attempt. There's my first attempt on this particular scene. I didn't get anything. Because I'm not that fast. You got to be really fast. Oh, there I got some lightning. So not bad. And then I tried it again and caught this. So a little bit of success. But there's better ways to do this, that's for sure.
Doug,
And so, go ahead, Terry.
yeah, so how do you anticipate the lightning strike?
Well, sometimes you hear thunder first, right? No, the lightning occurs first. So it's just a matter of guessing, and that's why it's not very successful. Terry, you should really use a lightning detection device, which I'll show you in just a sec. Okay, once again, if the technique, the exposure is longer, you can use, just to review, the Wild West approach, meaning push the shutter when you think the lightning's going to happen, or you can use a bulb method. And the third is to get a little help from a gadget friend. And some of you in this this group, your club, might have this. This is one I've played around with. I never bought one. They're not too expensive, but this is the Myops. I think, yeah, there it is, $220. And this detects the lightning and then opens up the shutter for you. So I was lucky enough to use a friend's, and I caught this, and that was all with that device. That's pretty good, isn't it? And so it takes all the guesswork out of it. You just sit there with your camera. The device does everything for you, opens up the shutter and shoots at the right time. And this guy, Jason Weingart, that's kind of what he specialized in. And I love his lightning shots. Just really beautiful. And you could actually, with these things, you could capture more than one lightning bolt. And just turning our attention towards fireworks, it's kind of similar to lightning, meaning that you meter for the ambient light, and then you have to consider the fireworks. And a starting point, once again, is that starting point we've been talking about, somewhere around ISO 100 f8 at between 10 and 30 seconds, depending on the ambient light. And once again, use your histogram to evaluate your exposure. And if the exposure is longer, the technique is that you can do the Wild West thing, once again, like the lightning, and you can use a bulb and a black card. Now, this is so much easier to do than, obviously, than lightning, because you can follow the fireworks as they leave, the ground, and then you can actually, determine when you want to remove the black card or hit the shutter to capture the lightning. And so here's an attempt, and certainly I think this is a little late because you get some of the parts of the fireworks that are, descending out of the sky. And so just a little bit of a challenge there. I probably could have removed the black card just a, half second earlier in this regard, but this one I did really well. Get a nice formed fireworks in the sky. And then you can get a lot too, more fireworks than just one, by using the black card and then capturing one and then capturing more. Like in this situation, this is beautifully done by, I don't know who this is, but beautiful job of using a black card to capture more than one. There's not too much involved here in terms of the fireworks. This one, too many, right, everybody? Don't you think? Too many fireworks in that shot?
Yeah.
This is so beautiful, especially with obviously the skyline. But this is just too many. I think it's all bunching up and mixing in, and just a little too complicated. You don't really know where to look in that situation.
What are you what are you doing with your aperture for a shot like this?
I just put it on f8. I just start there, and keep the ISO low. And then your shutter speed, you're basically on bulb with the black card, and that's
Right.
it.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool. That sounds fun.
Yeah, it is fun. It's a lot of fun. Certainly, just to see what you get, especially when you start doing multiple exposures, you kind of think about where they are in the sky, where they're coming up, because you don't want to bunch them up too much like this. This is so beautiful, just gorgeous. And then, this guy, I just found this on the internet, but I thought he had a great approach to fireworks, putting a subject in there, and then, and capturing the bokeh from the fireworks and the lights in the sky. Just a really wonderful picture. I like that idea a lot right there. Of course, the person has to have this person has a light on it, but a nice silhouette of a person with the night sky behind the silhouette might be a good thing to do. And we didn't have any fireworks this year. I was planning on going out, but we didn't have any because it's so dry here and it was kind of hot. So we didn't have any firework displays this year.
Yeah, I'll just interject, Doug, that you're at about an hour in. I'm not a
Thank
doctor.
you, Kyle. Yeah, thank you. Let's do it. This is a nice break. We're about to enter nautical twilight. So yeah, let's take a 5-minute break. Get up and move around.
Sounds good. So we'll see everybody back here at about 7:42.
7:42. All right. Thank you, Kyle. Yeah, let's turn the page here and just talk a little bit about going into night and the second twilight, which is the sun is below the horizon a little further, obviously, and it ends about an hour after sunset. And the significant thing about nautical twilight is the Earth and sky horizon, meaning the boundary between Earth and sky line, fades out. So at the end of nautical twilight, you can't make out landforms. And the mariners used to navigate by landforms. And by the end of that, they could no longer navigate. And so basically they called it nautical twilight for that purpose. What's significant for us in terms of nautical twilight is the blue hour, which starts in civil twilight, extends into nautical twilight. And you also begin to get planets forming in nautical twilight. So both of those things are pretty significant. The blue hour, which is such a beautiful time to shoot, and the idea that you start to get planets during this time period. So that's an hour after sunset. And it's such a beautiful shade of purpley blue that why would you ever want to change this in white balance? I have no idea, because it is so beautiful. And certainly here, the blue hour is such a fun time to shoot in my mind. It just adds just that quietness that some scenes like this need. If this was balanced towards white, it would completely change the feel of the photograph. And so I'm a firm believer, and I love shooting in the blue hour during nautical twilight. You have to get out there early in the morning, and you have to stay out a little bit later at night. But what a beautiful time to shoot. And so here you can start to see planets. And this is, you certainly notice the blue light. And this is what's called the blue hour. So it starts about 15 minutes before civil twilight ends, and it extends about a half an hour into nautical twilight. Just a beautiful, beautiful shades and hues of blue. All right, and the next twilight before we reach night is astronomical. So the sun is below the horizon even more. It ends about an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes after sunset, or like repeated in the morning before sunrise. And here, starlight becomes maximized at the end of it. So they call it astronomical twilight for that purpose, because starlight is maximized as we enter night. And just a beautiful time to think about shooting your stars is to pay attention to when astronomical twilight ends, so that you can plan on getting out there and getting set up and ready for night. And you can also obviously shoot during astronomical twilight, because you start to have stars and certainly planets are out. So great time to shoot. And here's just a comparison of the blue hour at the end of, or at the beginning of astronomical twilight, and then one that's taken about at the end of astronomical twilight. And look how many more stars are in the sky, because you're starting to get into night. So to maximize starlight, you want to start shooting in astronomical twilight and then into night. And when we think about shooting at night, in terms of composition, there's a couple different things that you should think about. Certainly you can allow the motion of stars, which is star trails, they call them star trails, or you can freeze the motion of stars, which is just called pinpoint stars. Now we think about a couple other things compositionally, and wide angle focal lengths allow you to gather more stars in your shot. So most people will shoot starlight with wider focal lengths. And you need to think about a foreground subject in most cases. So keep the foreground simple when it comes to your foreground, like we talked about with just silhouettes, because that's what they're going to become. And they have to be simple in order for your audience that you're communicating to, what those basically the foreground subjects are. And then the other thing to consider compositionally is moonlight or painting with light. Those are really fun to do at night because you are the controller of light when it comes to light painting, and or the moon is the controller of light, right? If it's out. So really fun ideas. And so we're going to look at a lot of different examples here. And one thing about the moonlight is that the moonlight dictates the shutter speed exposure. So, because there's light on the landscape. And so here, light in Zion National Park is illuminating the rocks and the tree. And you have to consider that when you're capturing star trails. So here you can see that there's fairly large star trails with a longer lens. But anyway, there's proper exposure on the landscape too. Here as well. You can see the moonlight, but this is a pinpoint star example. And you're going to use that exposure as well, considering that the pinpoint star calculations and the moonlight. So you'll sort of combine those two thoughts into one. But darker skies certainly become better for obviously gathering starlight. So new moon or less illumination is better. And a new moon provides that. If you can get away from ambient light, and that's why there's dark sky parks these days, and more being added all the time. But just thinking about this in terms of Colorado, where would you go, all you Coloradoans, in the Denver metro area to capture starlight? Where's the best place to go through your experiences?
Let's go east.
East.
Strasbourg.
All right, so away from the city to the east. I like that idea. Get an old barn or an old tree or something out there. Any others in the close range in the Front Range area? I would think Rocky Mountain National Park might be a good spot. You can get up Trail Ridge Road and get away from Estes Park there. Might be a really fun place to capture stars. Mount Evans. Anywhere else that I'm missing?
West Cliff is a dark area.
West Cliff, a great thought, Terry. I like that. West Cliff is very dark. Yeah, you get away into like South Park, away from the little towns, Fairplay, and out there might be pretty good. Yeah, quite a bit of places, and we're lucky. You're lucky, and I'm lucky in Montana that we have, we can get away to a dark sky place relatively easily. Some places like in the East Coast, it's hard to get away from light altogether like that. So yeah, we got to feel pretty lucky. And then certainly when you think about twilight, beyond astronomical twilight, you can maximize the dark sky and the twilight, or I mean the starlight. But here, once again, the moonlight is dictating the exposure on a star trail shot. And look how short the star trails are, because that's a full moon that's illuminating the landscape. So a little bit more of a challenge to get nice star trails when the moon is so bright. And that's why it's so nice to have a dark sky with a sliver of a moon or a new moon. So a little bit of planning, right? Love this shot. by Shingo. Just a ski trail at night. And once again, the moonlight is basically dictating the exposure, but Shingo is taking and using the pinpoint star exposure, I do believe, probably to capture, you know, Orion's belt there and some other stars and planets. You know, I didn't even see the light here when I first took this shot, and just a little bit of ambient light, you know, illuminated these trees in this shot. And I kind of like them, actually. For some strange, weird reason. I think they add a little bit of interest to the shot. And I think that might have been a car headlight that came through. So that's something you really have to be aware of, is the ambient light, and especially from cars. All right, so let's talk about pinpoints. And this includes the Milky Way, all these adjustments. So manual exposure, so bigger apertures will gather more starlight. You want to use higher ISOs. And I'm, you know, thinking about ISO, I'm starting to use less ISO than I did previously, because sometimes you can get too many stars and you start to lose constellations when you have so many stars that are being recorded. So I will usually stay around the 1200 ISO range now, or even the 800 ISO range. So I should change this slide to accommodate the kind of the new experiences that I've had. But yeah, somewhere between 800 and 1200 is probably pretty good. 3200, too many stars, I think. Has anybody experienced that? David, what was your comment?
I think, you know, at times you want to express, you know, the volume of stars, you know.
Yeah,
and that's what,
but yes,
but you're right about losing constellations, you know.
Yeah, sometimes it becomes like somebody poked a hole in the negative, and they just kept poking holes, and it just becomes like a too much texture, I think, or something like that.
Yeah. What's a
but
negative?
Yeah, exactly. Yep, exactly. But anyway, you want to always get your autofocus at infinity, and we can talk about that just briefly here in a minute, because that's a bit of a challenge. You can use the 400 rule or the NPF rule, and we'll talk about that a little bit as well. They're a little bit different, but that all has to do with the NPF rule in terms of your sensor and how many megapixels you have. They now have an NPF rule that we'll go over here in a minute. But long exposure noise reduction, just turn it off. There's much better ways to reduce noise in post-processing than in your camera. So just much better ways to go about that. So noise reduction off. Turn your screen brightness down so you can adjust to the new levels of brightness, and it won't fool you as much if you turn your screen brightness down. Some of those things, yeah, more important than others, but I think all of them are worth mentioning. So besides the stars, pinpoint stars in the Milky Way, what else can you use this rule for? Another phenomenon in the sky that occurs in the north.
Northern Lights.
That's exactly right, Madeline. You can use these same rules for the Northern Lights. So I need to add that to the slide as well. The Northern Lights, the aurora. So there's nice stars. It's almost bordering on too many, but certainly I think the Milky Way is the star of the show here, and so that's been well captured. But anyways, in terms of the infinity mark, you can't just turn your focus to infinity like this, because that's normally not at infinity, even though the mark says so. Because I have there's the infinity mark, it's a lazy 8 that, and there's your focus mark below it. Because that normally focuses not at infinity, it's normally too far or not far enough. So the idea is that here's a lens that I have where focus at 17 millimeters is here. And focus at 35 millimeters is in a different place. So that infinity mark cannot be relied upon. But you should focus when you have light, especially on cameras, the older cameras, because it's really hard to focus on the stars and low megapixel cameras. There's so much video noise that sometimes it's hard to focus on the stars. So it's helpful to focus on something at infinity during the day, like a mountain top or a building or something like that, and then tape your lens so that the focus does not move, because it's easy to bump it and you don't want to bump it. So just get your focus at infinity. Don't worry about that infinity mark, and tape your lens if you're ever concerned about moving the focus. And remember, you're at manual focus. You don't want to be at autofocus, obviously. All right, and pinpoint stars, there's a lot of different, a lot of the same variables involved, but there's some that are a little bit different. So you're going to use the 400 rule, which basically is you take the focal length, take 400 divided by the focal length, and that's the longest shutter speed you should use. And if you have a crop sensor, I think it was Terry that brought this up. Basically, you need to multiply the sensor crop by the focal length before you divide it into 400. And that, once again, is your shutter speed. And photo pills, is a great application for your smartphone or your tablet. You can, it's $10, but it's well worth the money. I'm sure a lot of people in this group have photo pills. Is that true? Do a lot of people have it?
I don't.
I do.
Kyle, do you have it?
No. But
Oh,
I
it's
think
a great.
like Terry does or somebody.
Yeah, Kyle, did you say make mention of that?
No, I just felt bad that nobody was answering, so I just said that I don't have it. But that might change. It looks pretty cool.
Oh my God, it's great for all kinds of different reasons, for hyperfocal focusing, for pinpoint stars, star trails. It has a photo ephemeris kind of thing where you can judge heights of mountains and determine when moons are going to come over mountains. It's all kinds of stuff, but well worth the $10 that you spend on that thing. But here's the two things, the 500 rule, which they don't even list a 400 rule, but it evolved from 500 because the cameras were getting so much better. But you can see the difference between the 500 rule and the MPF rule. And that takes into account the megapixels of your camera. And what it's doing is basically saying, we don't want to notice that these stars are moving. And so that's what the MPF rule and the 400 rule are designed for, is to basically get the stars so they aren't showing motion. Anyway, that's a great app for determining that MPF rule. So pinpoint stars. So here's a nice pinpoint star example. Quite a few stars and planets, but I don't think too many. Another one where there's, good stars. The Milky Way is in there. Not a great Milky Way. It's not the optical center of the galaxy, our galaxy that we're in. And basically photopills and some other apps will show you, Star Chart will show you where the center of the galaxy, or the Milky Way is, which produces some really beautiful compositions to your photos. But here, doing a little light painting, pinpoint star example. And that's a beautiful sky, nice amount of stars. And then painting some of the building here. Quite a bit of painting here by Royce. And look at that, lots of processing after the fact to get the Milky Way to look like that. And look at that, you can almost see clouds in the sky that are green. I don't think that's the aurora, but certainly, those green clouds with the blue and the purple behind it is just beautiful. Out at the Grand Tetons. I think that's one of the Mormon barns out there. And like I mentioned, the Aurora Borealis, and you can see the pinpoint star behind that up north. All right, so you can use that pinpoint star exposure for lots of things, the Milky Way, for stars, and the aurora. And then star trails, in terms of the differences, certainly, and similarities, manual exposure in bigger apertures, just like pinpoint stars, are appropriate. But here the ISO setting is low, because you don't need higher ISOs to capture the light because your shutter is open longer. Autofocus off, so you're going to once again focus at infinity. And your shutter's going to be on bulb. And all you have to do is consider the battery, because you're open for so long. And or you can blend pinpoint stars, which is another way, so that you're using the pinpoint star exposure, but you're creating a lot of different shots. So you're set up a intervalometer to create all those shots, so that you can blend them all together, and that way you get a star trail out of the blend, and you don't have any problem with the noise because your ISO is low. So once again, two ways to go about that in terms of the shutter speed: blending pinpoint exposures and or using the shutter on bulb. And that you have to just think about your battery. And then long exposure noise reduction, I turned it off because basically I use the noise reduction in post-processing. But if you use it for long exposures, then basically maybe you only use it for your last shot, because then you can basically take the shot and put your camera in the trunk, and the additional processing in camera, which is double the shutter speed. Basically you can just, it can be working on that while you're driving home or doing whatever. Because if you have a 3-minute exposure or 5-minute exposure or whatever doing star trails, and you have your long exposure noise reduction on, then once the shutter closes, the camera processes the image for that equal amount of time, so 3 to 5 minutes. So if you're out there just shooting and you're just waiting and waiting and waiting, that's just not very productive. So I would recommend just turning it off and handling the noise reduction post-process.
Hey, Doug, just a quick question. You mentioned here in the other slides about bigger apertures. Are you talking about 2.8, 1.4, something in between?
More like 4, something like that. So because you don't want it, because you start to lose a little quality at the widest apertures, you know, so like 1.8, you're going to start to lose a little bit of quality, because remember, the aperture in terms of the middle of the range is the sharpest aperture in the camera in terms of for that lens. So if you go from 2.8 to 22, the sharpest part of the sharpest aperture in that lens is basically f8. And as you move towards 2.8, you're going to get less quality. And so I would open up the aperture, but not open it all the way up to its widest. So maybe f4, something like that, is good. But that's a great question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. And, you know, here I just played around with the North Star up in the corner. Look at, there's no foreground here. But it's kind of interesting. I normally try to find a foreground for my star shots, but this one I didn't, and I kind of like it. And we'll talk about briefly how to find the North Star, because that's important when you think about long exposures in terms of star trails. You want to know where the North Star is, because everything revolves around that particular point in the Northern Hemisphere. Does anybody know what the equivalent is in the Southern Hemisphere in terms of a South Star? Well, I don't either. I was hoping somebody would know. Is it the Southern Cross? Does anybody know?
It's maybe a star in the Southern Cross.
It's the biggest star. Thank you, David. It's the biggest star in the Southern Cross. All right. I knew that it had something to do with that. But anyway, we'll discuss a little bit about how to find the North Star in just a sec. But the idea is that, yeah, it's fun to put foreground subjects in. Certainly this Rhyolite in Death Valley has some really cool buildings. And here the full moon is once again determining the star trail. So you have to expose for the moon. And when you think about that, it becomes a little bit challenging at a low ISO to expose for the moon. And so what I've found, which is the easiest way to determine the exposure, is to crank up the ISO until you get a good exposure at 30 seconds, because 30 seconds is the longest your camera will meter for the light. And so if you crank up your ISO and then put it on 30 seconds, then you'll get an exposure that's proper. And then you're going to reciprocate the relationship to add more time because you're lowering the ISO down to its lowest. And so let's just go through that particular scenario to determine a good exposure when the moon is out, or ambient light for that matter too. You know, like whatever, city light or a carnival or whatever it might be. As long as there's some natural ambient or artificial light coming in, you have to consider it. So let's look at that. So let's reciprocate the exposure from a higher ISO. So if we crank up, we set our camera to 30 seconds and we crank up our ISO and we get a good exposure at 6400 on the ambient light from the last picture, like the moon, then basically now we can work backwards to get to a star trail exposure. So we work backwards, reciprocating, and we go from 6400 and we close down to 3200, then we open up to a full minute. And then we close down to 1600 and we open up to 2 minutes. We close down to 800 and we open up to 4 minutes. We close down to 400 and we open up to 8 minutes. And we close down to 200 and we go to 16 minutes. And then we close down, if your ISO at its native is 100, then you're shooting at 32 minutes. And now you have the proper exposure for the ambient light, because that's what this is determined by. And then you have nice long exposure for the star trails. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah. It's just using the reciprocal relationship, but the initial thing is to set your camera to 30 seconds, because that's as long as you can basically meter a scene in terms of shutter speed. Can't go longer than that. Crank up your ISO till you get a good exposure and then start reciprocating to get to a longer shutter speed for the star trail.
Yeah, that makes good sense. That's
Okay, good.
perfect.
Thank you, Kyle. So here, my first initial reading at 30 seconds was 1600. And basically then I did the reciprocating and my exposure turned out to be 200 on this camera at 4 minutes. And so that's a 4-minute exposure for the stars. And that's why they're so short. But good exposure for the ambient light from the moon. So you have to do a little mental gymnastics there to get to a certain point. But you know, that's why another thing, you know, a calculator can help you do that. Like photo pills, you'd be able to calculate this pretty easy using that particular application. And in terms of finding the North Star, like in this shot, you see the North Star right above the white cathedral there, whatever that formation is in Zion, you can see it. To find that, when you're just looking at stars that are, you know, still in the sky, you basically just use the Big Dipper and the Little Dipper. So if you look at the Big Dipper, the end of the cup, the face of that cup points up to the handle of the Little Dipper, the next brightest star in the sky, and that is the North Star. So you can also use an app, but the first thing to recognize is the Little Dipper or the Big Dipper. But you know, if you don't see that, then maybe you can use like a star chart here, and that just has all the grid lines, which are a little hard to see in this slide, point up to the brightest star in that circle, and that is the North Star. So you can get there by just noticing the stars, Big Dipper, Little Dipper, or you can use an application like this on your phone. But it's fun to play around with that in terms of, like here in this view of Death Valley, I composed so that the North Star was in the center of the frame and everything moved around it. And then I allowed one tail light to go all the way through the shot. And then I blocked the front of the lens with a black card, like I do with fireworks, basically, and allowed one headlight to come through. And I just raised and put my cover in front of the lens and created like a little repeating white light through the red light. So I did that with a card. And you can see that every time I blocked additional cars and such, it produced a little blip in the star trail. And so I'm feeling like that's the Da Vinci Code, but I haven't figured it out yet. But here's another fun shot, just a balanced rock with the North Star over the top of balanced rock, getting a little ambient light with from a parking lot and the road, which I think kind of adds to it, which is kind of a neat addition to this particular shot. And then painting with light, super fun to go out there and be the master of the painting, in terms of what you get. And you can see the moon is out, so that's dictating the exposure on the star trails and some of the landscape. But then I lit up part of this in the foreground, and Tim lit up the inside of the building. So we just had fun, playing around with light. But painting exposure. So in pinpoint stars, when you think about how long you need to paint, with high ISOs, 1200, something like that, you're going to paint very quickly, like 1 to 2 seconds on a particular spot that you're painting. With star trails, you're gonna basically paint much longer, obviously, because there's a lower ISO. So you're gonna be talking 30 seconds to a minute. So the idea is that basically, once again, if you get a good exposure at 3200 at 2 seconds, instead of trial and error, you basically can just interpolate that through the reciprocal relationship. So the ISO is high, the shutter speed is 2 seconds to get good exposure on the paint job. And then if you want to change that relationship, you just use the reciprocal relationship. So here I'm painting for 4 seconds at 1600, 8 seconds at 800. Once again, 1600, 16 seconds at 400, and so on. 32 seconds at 200. And 1 minute at 100. So if you're doing a star trail shot and you want to calculate what the exposure is for a paint job, then once again, crank up the ISO, paint for a couple seconds, and then reciprocate the relationship, and it'll tell you exactly how long you need to paint for on a star trail shot.
How do you meter the painting?
Well, if it's good here, who was that just asked that?
This is Mark speaking.
Okay, Mark.
So I'm thinking
Yeah,
of
Mark,
painting with a floodlight or a battery-powered floodlight or something like that.
Yeah. If you're painting with a flashlight or whatever, some kind of painting tool, then basically crank up your ISO. And if you paint like for 2 seconds and it looks good, you're like, ooh, that's really good. Then you just reciprocate the relationship down to 100, and you're going to paint that same area for a full minute at ISO 100 compared to ISO 200 at 2 seconds.
Okay, thanks.
See what I mean? Because just think about this, Mark. If you paint for a full minute and you're like, oh God, it's overexposed. And then you try a minute and a half or 50 seconds and it's still overexposed. So you're still just guessing. And you're having to spend a lot of time painting as opposed to jacking up the ISO first and then a shorter paint job and then reciprocating. Okay, and when you think about the angle for your paint job, my view is side light is super sweet, backlight is pretty cool, but front light is so boring. And why is front light so boring? Like this shot that I took of my first paint job in Arches National Park, Skyline Arch. What is it about front lighting that's so different from side and back? Go ahead, Carl.
I was just gonna say it's just flat. There's no texture or anything.
That's exactly right. Front lighting is flat. So if you're behind your camera and you're painting the subject in front of you, you're basically going to just produce some really flat lighting. And so it's helpful to obviously have a partner or set a timer on your camera so that you can run away from the camera and paint from the side. Of course, backlight is pretty cool too, because then the contrast is really high, but front lighting is not great. So here, I ran out there, someone was controlling my camera, and I painted the rock in front of me. That's just me standing there. And you can see how flat it is. But then we also painted, with help, assistance, painted the foreground with light, and that added lots of texture to that particular foreground. So it's just something that you should really think about when you're painting stuff. Like here, this photographer painted Delicate Arch, and it's just so flat. It's kind of a cool picture, but not great. I think it could be done better. And here's a different approach to it. And you can see how the side lighting here is just producing lots of depth in the subject. So side light is generally the thing you want to do. And here that you can see that the photographer in this shot is actually painting the light that's illuminating the rock behind this person to basically create the silhouette, but you can see how flat it is. So there's a couple different painting things going on here. And the one on the arch is beautiful because it's side lit. So get off to the side to do all your painting. And here, beautiful kind of a paint job. I don't know how this person did it, but a little front lit on the building, but there's a little shadows in there. So they're from the side, you can see the little shadows on some of the walls and stuff, and on the trees. And here, moonlight is creating the light on the middle ground, the cliffs and arches, or I mean Zion. And then these rocks in front of us, basically were in total darkness because the moon hadn't risen high enough to illuminate the rocks. And so we painted the rocks and allowed the moonlight to get the mountains in the background. And we tried to create the same angle on the paint job as the moonlight, which I think we were successful in. And then what about the overall exposure? What method are we using to capture the starlight? Pinpoint stars, right, everybody? So yeah, we had just that amount of time to paint everything. Was because the pinpoint star exposure was dictating the overall shutter speed. And here, my buddy drove a car down the road to illuminate the fence and the building in the foreground, but then using the pinpoint star example, the equation to get the starlight, and then the storm that was going on, all the lightning within the cloud obviously illuminated the whole cloud in this situation. And this was the storm that knocked out Scotty's Castle for 4 or 5 years. That all that storm system just created a huge flood that took out part of Scotty's Castle. And then this person, Eric Parra, is a really unique kind of light painter. I love his work, and I don't know if I go to this extent to create something like this, but certainly he does. And he's pretty well known, and he creates some really beautiful work. So here, creating a star trail, right, everybody? Star trails, and then had someone go in there with a lightsaber, and the model isn't even holding the lightsaber. So someone went into the scene during the exposure and did the sort of ribbon of light around this model and created that beautiful light that surrounds her. I love that. Here's another one of his. So he really goes above and beyond the call to get you know, some really interesting pictures. And another one of Eric's.
Well, if any of us were to submit this to one of our monthly competitions, the judge would immediately say, especially the first one, like the first of these three, would immediately say, "Oh, that's a composite." And we don't get to talk. We can't say it's not.
Oh, really, Mark?
Nowadays, with all the post-processing that we do, when somebody just say, "Oh, it's a composite."
Well, I don't know what to say about that because I know it's not a composite.
Oh,
Because
I know it's not a composite,
yeah,
but
I don't know how you go about resolving that. You just have to take it with a grain of salt, I guess, and know that you didn't do that because Eric Parra has lots of videos on how he does his stuff.
yeah, no, I know he's
Oh,
really,
okay.
just saying
Yeah.
that I have a couple of shots that I didn't submit because I felt that they would be assumed to be composites, and then immediately that would diminish the quality of the shot, right? So,
Oh, right. Yeah, Mark.
Mark,
Well, that's
Mark,
too
I
bad.
would think it depends. It depends on which competition. I mean, an image like this, I would think a lot of judges have seen stuff like this. They're aware that you know, there are light bars out there, and you know, you can do a long exposure and create
yeah,
these kind of effects with the light bar. I would think a number of them would be okay with it, but
Yeah.
also, you know, we do allow composites in our competitions unless we specifically say no composites.
well, yeah,
But
but
as a general rule, they are there. I don't know that necessarily a judge would ding it because it's a composite. You know, obviously, looking at something like this is a very effective image, even
yeah,
if it was a composite.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and I think that's what it really comes down to is how
yeah,
good is the image, how effective is the image.
yeah.
I agree with you completely.
Uh,
Doesn't matter how you get there. Either
Two-
or. But the interesting thing about it is that he does do this in one shot with no compositing. You know, that's the beauty of this is being able to do all that.
Yeah, that's
Uh,
pretty amazing.
yeah, pretty amazing. And like this is equally as amazing. You know, twirling the light around with, I don't even know how he did this, but certainly it's
That looks like one of those burning steel wool on a string kind of things.
yeah, that's what it looks like, Carl. You're right about that.
Yeah, that was real popular a couple of years ago, and a few photographers got some bad press about it because they started fires.
Oh no. Oh my God.
Yeah, well, obviously out there in the middle of the desert, you're safe, but there were people that did it like in their backyard or some other place where, you know, or out in the woods or a forest or something where it was not the right thing to do.
God, no. Oh my God. Could you imagine? And I got one more of Eric's, which is this one, you know, that you've seen. Just beautiful work with where he's drawing with light, painting with light. Just gorgeous. But
Hey,
like I
Mark.
said, I wouldn't get into it this much, that's for sure.
Mark Todd here. Again, I think Carl's point is on an open competition that it shouldn't be an issue on an open competition.
No.
But my other idea would be to title it
yeah,
not a composite.
I actually thought of that. I was going to title it something single exposure, and put into the title the comment that I would like to illegally communicate to the judge.
Yeah, that's a good solution, Mark.
So,
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. Well, it sounds like you're going to resolve that issue, which is great. So yeah, that's you know, in terms of light painting, just gives you some ideas of what's possible, you know, besides the standard just illuminating something, which that's all I do is illuminate a foreground something, whether it's a headstone in a cemetery or a fence in Death Valley, you know. I try to keep it simple. I don't go into this, but I appreciate this sort of level of expertise, certainly. That's for sure, because it's gorgeous, right? All right. Well, just before we wrap things up, we've been going for a couple hours. I just wanted to say thank you very much. Really appreciate your time, and I hope you got a couple things out of that presentation. And just I mentioned that in terms of workshops, I have a couple still this fall that have 1 or 2 spots in them. We're going to Utah and Monument Valley for ancient landscapes, which is going to be, Native American ruins, and obviously Monument Valley, the beautiful buttes and such. 2 different trips there in late August and September, and then Death Valley in October, late October, going back there. And I can't wait to see how Death Valley's changed after their flooding, which is going to be very interesting. And then that trip to Namibia, which is a longer trip, but that's starting next year. But we're taking people signing up now. If you ever wanted to go to Namibia, that's a big adventure and very beautiful. I went there last winter and it was absolutely amazing. So anyway, you can go to my website. Kyle mentioned it. If you're considering jumping into homeroom, you don't have to submit anything. Just come and just say hello and see through that process. And that happens every couple weeks. We have homeroom tomorrow, and the topic is Earth and Sky. And then we'll go 2 weeks from tomorrow again. So it's a free night, and you just have to sign up on the website so that we know who's going to be there, so we can send them the Zoom link.
Carl, in the comments section, Carl put Doug's website. If you scroll up to the top, you'll see it there.
Oh, thank you, Carl and Kyle. Thank you very much.
And I just dropped in a link directly to the homeroom page.
Okay, cool. That's awesome. It's super fun, and I know you guys meet twice a month, so that's really cool. I think that's great, and I love going to your website to see all the contests and what you guys have going on. That was a true pleasure. Some really good work there. But then, in terms of what I do, my online classes, which I don't have a lot going on because I'm working on 2025, but we have all kinds of online classes that you can view, and the dates are tentative because those are kind of not set in stone, but keep an eye out for those. And if you use Cam Club 2024, you get a little bit of a discount on anything that I offer. So anyway, I just want to say I'm going to stop sharing. All my 2025 is going to be up in the next couple weeks, probably by the end of July. There'll be a whole new schedule. So I'm really excited about next year. And I just want to say thank you guys for having me and the opportunity to discuss night photography. I love it. And heck, just appreciate you.
I thought it was a really cool presentation, Doug. Really, I jotted down a lot more notes than I do for most presentations, because it seems like every 5 minutes you were telling me something.
Oh, good. Kyle, thank you. And you guys will all I appreciate that. And you guys have the recording so that you can, fast forward and pause and whatever you need to do as you look through it. But, and thank you for that, Kyle. And I just want to say thanks. And Carl, it's nice to see your face. Appreciate that. And shot from Denver. And being in Montana, we have such long winters, and most of the days are really cloudy during the winter. It's like Seattle weather here. And so I so appreciate you guys and value your living in Colorado, because those 320 days of sunshine I could use in the middle of January, so very nice. You guys live in a great state. Anyway, well, thank you guys. I appreciate it. And have a great evening. So much. And I hope it doesn't get too hot there this summer.
Well, I wish you
Yeah. Well, I hope it doesn't last too long. That's for sure.
There you go. That we can probably.
And happy shooting, everybody.
I
Thank
know
you so
enough to
much.
wish you a happy civil twilight.
Hey, thank you very much, Mark. That's awesome because that's one of my favorite times of the day is civil twilight. So thank you for
That's
that.
great,
That means a lot.
It's hilarious.
I love it.
No,
Thanks,
I,
Doug.
I
All right.
appreciate you
Thanks,
Take care,
Doug.
y'all.
All
Bye-bye.
right.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Oh, I
everyone.
guess this is the end now. Okay. Toodaloo.